Chapter 1. The Darkness Falls. The first reports came from fishing vessels off the coast of Maine. Their radios went silent at 7:42 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a crisp autumn afternoon. No distress calls, no mayday signals, just silence. By 11:45 a.m. the next morning, the Eastern Seaboard of the United States plunged into darkness. Traffic lights blinked out, hospital generators failed to kick in, and planes began their fatal descent into the Atlantic Ocean, leaving trails of smoke in their wake. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic in the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Oliver Bennett was addressing Parliament when Westminster went dark. The backup generators failed to activate, and the historic chamber was plunged into shadow, illuminated only by the weak autumn sunlight filtering through the windows. In the ensuing confusion, the Prime Minister was evacuated to a secure location beneath Downing Street.
Status report,
Bennett ordered, as his security detail guided him through narrow corridors by flashlight.
It's widespread, sir,
Replied his chief of staff, scrolling through a rapidly dying tablet.
All of London, the southern coast. Reports coming in from Edinburgh and Belfast as well. Total electrical failure.
the Americans.
The same, sir. And preliminary reports suggest the entire Atlantic coastline is affected, from Norway to Morocco.
In Moscow, President Darryl Kokoloff was awakened by his security chief at 11:42 p.m. local time. The Russian leader, known for his ice-cold demeanor, showed rare concern when informed that the entirety of Russia's Western naval forces had gone silent simultaneously.
The Black Sea Fleet, the Northern Fleet.
Kokoloff asked.
All communications lost, Mr. President, and St. Petersburg has gone dark. Moscow is unaffected so far, but the blackout appears to be moving eastward along our western regions.
Kokoloff's first thought was of American aggression, perhaps a new weapon test gone awry. His second thought was more pragmatic. Advantage. With NATO countries along the Atlantic in chaos, opportunities would emerge.
Contact Beijing.
He ordered.
I want to speak with President Chen immediately.
In Beijing, President Chen Liang had already convened an emergency meeting of the Central Military Commission. Although China's east coast faced the Pacific rather than the Atlantic, the implications of a massive power failure affecting Western powers demanded immediate assessment.
Is this our doing?
Chen asked her defense minister bluntly when they were alone.
No, Ms. President. Our electromagnetic pulse technologies are advanced, but nothing in our arsenal could cause effects of this magnitude.
The Russians, then? Or the Americans testing something they shouldn't?
Unknown, Ms. President. But our intelligence suggests all parties are equally surprised.
As reports continued to flow in, President Chen made a calculated decision.
Increase our military readiness to level 2 and prepare relief supplies, medicine, food, generators. We may find diplomatic opportunities in this crisis.
Within hours, the leaders of the world's most powerful nations were grappling with a catastrophe that defied explanation and testing how it might shift the global balance of power. Sandy Reeves, Sandy to her colleagues at the National Marine Fisheries Service, was examining tissue samples from a peculiar deep-sea specimen when her laboratory went dark. The backup generator should have activated immediately, but nothing happened. Through the large bay windows of her coastal Maine laboratory, She watched as the lights of Portland winked out street by street, like dominoes falling in sequence.
What the hell?
She muttered, instinctively reaching for her cell phone. No signal. Her satellite phone, dead. Even her battery-operated flashlight refused to work. As daylight faded, reports trickled in through runners and messengers on bicycles. The blackout wasn't isolated to Maine or even the East Coast. Every nation bordering the Atlantic had gone dark simultaneously. Planes had dropped from the sky. Satellites had fallen. Ships had lost all power and were drifting helplessly. The Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard of technology. In Washington, D.C., President Barron's Trumsky had been meeting with his Joint Chiefs when the White House went dark. Secret Service agents immediately moved him to a secure location beneath the White House, a bunker designed to withstand nuclear attacks. It couldn't, however, maintain power any better than the corner store on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Get me answers,
The president requested in an authoritative tone, his face illuminated by the flickering glow of hastily deployed candles.
Is this the Chinese? The Russians?
The Secretary of Defense wiped sweat from his brow.
We can't confirm anything, Mr. President. All communications are down. We're completely in the dark, literally and figuratively.
What about the diplomatic channels, the secure lines to Moscow and Beijing?
All down, sir. We've tried Morse code, signal lamps, everything short of carrier pigeons. Nothing's getting through to either the Russians or Chinese.
The Secretary of State interjected,
Mr. President, before communications failed, we received fragmentary reports that Moscow and Beijing are experiencing similar phenomena along their Atlantic-facing territories. St. Petersburg is completely dark. This doesn't appear to be a targeted attack against the United States.
Trumsky's eyes narrowed.
Or it's meant to look that way. Both Russia and China have been investing heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities. This could be a test or a prelude to something worse.
Then get me people who can confirm something.
Trumsky snapped.
Form a task force. Get our best people. I want answers by tomorrow.
Outside the White House, Washington, D.C. had descended into chaos. Without traffic lights, intersections became scenes of twisted metal and shattered glass. Hospitals struggled to maintain life support systems. The modern world, so dependent on electricity, crumbled in a matter of hours. By midnight, reports confirmed what many feared. The blackout extended to every nation with an Atlantic coastline. From Norway to Argentina, from Canada to Morocco, darkness had fallen on nearly 1 billion people. As dawn broke the next day, the true scope of the disaster became apparent. Commercial jets and military aircraft alike had plummeted into the ocean or crashed onto land. Satellites had fallen from orbit, raining debris across coastal areas. Ships drifted aimlessly. The death toll already reached into the thousands, with tens of thousands more missing. In London, Prime Minister Bennett surveyed the damage from a military helicopter, powered by a hastily modified mechanical engine. The Thames was choked with dead vessels, and fires burned unchecked across parts of the city where gas lines had ruptured. The iconic London skyline, normally illuminated by countless lights, stood dark and foreboding against the gray morning sky.
The hospitals.
Bennett asked his emergency response coordinator.
Critical patients are being moved inland to facilities beyond the blackout zone. We've got army medics using hand-powered equipment where possible. The death toll in London alone is estimated at 600, with thousands injured.
And our nuclear facilities.
Sellafield and other sites initiated emergency shutdown protocols. Backup cooling systems are operating on steam power where possible, but we're racing against time.
Back in Moscow, President Kokolov received his first direct communication from Beijing, a message delivered by a diplomatic courier who had flown to the still-functioning Moscow International Airport on a Chinese military aircraft specially modified with mechanical backup systems.
President Chen proposes a joint humanitarian and investigative effort, the courier reported, handing over a sealed document. China is prepared to provide significant resources to affected regions, including Russian territories, in exchange for access and information sharing.
Kokolov understood the underlying message. China was positioning itself as the savior of a crippled world. It was a diplomatic masterstroke that would be difficult to counter.
Tell President Chen we are open to coordination.
Kokolov replied carefully.
But Russia will maintain sovereign control over its response efforts.
He paused.
And what of the Americans?
There has been no direct contact with Washington. President Chen believes this is an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of our collaborative approach over American isolationism.
Kokolov nodded slowly. The global order was already shifting. In the Oval Office, illuminated now by oil lamps, President Trumsky convened the hastily assembled Atlantic Event Response Team, AERT. The team comprised officials from the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NASA, the intelligence community, and key scientific advisors.
An EMP attack,
suggested General Michael Hayes, chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Has to be. Nothing else could cause this kind of widespread electrical failure.
Dr. Eliza Chen, the Energy Secretary, shook her head.
An EMP wouldn't affect battery-powered devices or mechanical systems. This is something else entirely. Whatever it is, it's disrupting the fundamental principles of electromagnetism, at least in the affected areas.
China has been researching quantum-level electromagnetic disruption,
offered CIA Director Thomas Wilson.
And the Russians have always been ahead of us in directed energy weapons.
What about coordination between them?
Trumsky asked.
Russia and China have been conducting joint military exercises with increasing frequency over the past 2 years.
It's possible,
Wilson admitted.
Our intelligence indicates their defense ministries have increased communication significantly in recent months. However, both countries are experiencing similar effects along their Atlantic coasts, unless this is an experiment gone terribly wrong.
Or a calculated sacrifice,
the president countered.
The Russians especially have a history of accepting casualties to advance strategic goals.
The Secretary of State cleared her throat.
Mr. President, we've received word through diplomatic back channels that both China and Russia are organizing humanitarian relief efforts. Beijing has offered aid to affected European nations, and Moscow is positioning itself as the coordinator for Eastern European response.
They're taking advantage of the situation,
Trumsky said flatly.
Buying influence while we're struggling to get our lights on.
It might be more than that, sir,
the secretary continued.
The UK has reported that Chinese diplomats are requesting access to affected areas for their scientific teams. Prime Minister Bennett is hesitant but desperate for assistance.
The president nodded grimly.
I want proof before we point fingers. In the meantime, we need power. We can't coordinate a response in the dark.
We've already begun implementing a contingency plan,
said Dr. Chen.
We're retrofitting coal plants for steam power generation. It's primitive, but it should work. The technology doesn't rely on complex electronics.
How long?
The president asked.
3 days for the first facilities. A week before we have a functional grid, even at minimal capacity.
Trumsky nodded.
Make it happen. Prioritize military installations, command centers, and hospitals. And find me those responsible. I want names.
As Washington scrambled to restore some semblance of order, Sandy Reeves noticed something strange happening along the Maine coastline. Strange deep-sea creatures, species that typically never approach the surface, were washing ashore in unprecedented numbers. Giant squid, anglerfish, gulper eels, creatures of the deep now lying dead on the beaches by the hundreds. Sandy's laboratory remained powerless, but her curiosity drove her to examine these specimens, using the most basic tools of her trade: a magnifying glass and a scalpel. What she found disturbed her deeply. The creatures showed signs of rapid, impossible evolution. Organs were transforming, reshaping themselves for purposes she couldn't identify. But without her equipment, without electricity, she could only document and wonder. Little did she know that these dead sea creatures heralded the first sign of a transformation that would soon threaten humanity's very existence.